So we will explore some more literary theories, starting with Marxist theory for to be or not to be. Now, this one could be really cool because now it doesn't say anything about Edward being his whatever job he has, right? It doesn't mention his economic status. So I have Vonnegut was an adamant critic of capitalism, and his works themes remain evidence of this. As Vonnegut implores, so this would be a quote, all right? And I took this quote from the Gannon and Wilson article where they talked about his objection to capitalism, saying it's inhumane and it is heavily invested in the accumulation of capital than it is in the human. So I go on, right, to say the authors of this article are using to be or not to be as evidence to support their claim. In this dystopian story, a man named Edward Welling must decide on two more family members to die so that all three of his infant triplets can be permitted to survive. While Vonnegut never mentions the economic status of the characters or society, the story's antagonist proclaims population control is imperative, so resources do not run scarce. Dr. Hitz goes on to make a statement about people in the population feeling entitled to breed like rabbits. Okay, this is where it gets where we can really make a statement, right? So that phrasing, breed like rabbits, was actually used by Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, in the 1940s when there was this horrible famine taking place in Bangladesh, which at the time was known as the British Raj, or the Indian subcontinent. Britain had colonized it. And we have Churchill's total disregard concerning British colonial policy of exporting food from their Indian subcontinent colonies to soldiers fighting in World War II could be compared to Dr. Hitz's view of generations before him. The similarities in rhetoric could be Vonnegut's attempt to point out the utter hypocrisy in his fiction tale. Readers can assume that those in power could have created a more humane solution than the option given to Edward. So, in this literary analysis, if you were to do a Marxist theory, you could kind of explore this idea that there are resources involved, and we have to assume that the population is being controlled for maybe the elite's motivations to benefit the wealthy. They're controlling the population of the poor. And here would be another article that you can use for this, and it's in your active reading packet. So we have this is from BBC, Population Control, Is It a Tool of the Rich? And this article goes through the history of governments doing different types of population controls measures. So as the world reaches an estimated 7 billion, people like Vivek say efforts to bring down the world's population must continue if life on Earth is to be sustainable and if poverty and even mass starvation is to be avoided. And it would start, okay, so they start with this Reverend Thomas Malthus, a clergyman born in the 18th century, who had this belief that humans would always produce faster than the Earth's capacity to feed them. So going on, we had American philanthropists starting food aid, things like that. That was to help the population, not to control the population, though, right? So, in 1966, we had President Lyndon Johnson warn that the U.S. might be overwhelmed by desperate masses, and he made U.S. foreign aid dependent on countries adopting family planning programs. Wait a minute. This means that if you were a country like, I don't know, like Venezuela, if you wanted to receive money, aid money from the United States, you would have to have some type of family planning programs, meaning um, clinics where women could get either or men could be sterilized. Men would get vasectomies, women would get their tubes tied, or they would just put women on birth control pills. Or in some cases, like some birth control methods, and I'll show you in another article, they insert it inside the woman. And then if you don't tell the woman that she has something preventing pregnancy inside her, she could literally have it inside of her forever if no one ever takes it out. Or it could cause serious problems, even though it's teensy, like an IUD. Um, it could still be really bad health wise. And not only that, ethically, people are medical professionals are supposed to um, inform their patients on any procedures they're doing, obviously. So that could be an article we use. And then another big example of population control is the one child policy in China, which this article is going to touch on. You could definitely do a historical analysis on this one child policy. That's a big one. So wait, if I was going to go up, so that could be ideas for your Marxists. Now, if I did a historical analysis, um, readers may find themselves alarmed to learn that the history of population control is not a new government policy. And then you could talk about one example of a population control method that saw disastrous results is the implementation of China's one child policy. And then you could talk about using the BBC article here. We can talk about, let's see, assessed by numbers alone, it is said to be the far most successful population control initiative, yet remains deeply controversial. Um, a few years after its inception, the policy was relaxed to allow couples two children and if their first baby was not a boy. This is where it brings in the big thing, okay? Because in China, you could say South Korea is this way as well, in Vietnam, their families take care of each other, not like in America where I guess you would go to like an old folks home. Um, but a daughter marries her husband, obviously. So a daughter would marry into her husband's family. And that daughter would end up taking care of the parents of the husband. So this policy was problematic because if parents had a daughter, then they would have no other opportunity to have a son, and therefore they would have no one to care for them in their old age. It's really mean. Like, you can't say the husband would be like, yeah, your parents can come too. But anyway, that was just it. I mean, I'm sure there was situations where people were kind, but then there was also situations where the husband and the family probably was not kind. And then, so there was this infanticide situation. That is a huge comparison. And if you were to look up this and you looked up China infanticide during one child, you could find a lot of information. And it's obviously really sad. But this would be a good example. And it's an article here. And you could talk about, here, I'll put it in. So if you wanted to do that route, a striking similarity to the story was the phenomenon, or um was the high likelihood that infant daughters would be given up for adoption or even killed. There were also examples of very late term abortions, so much so that the government banned ultrasounds during this period, or banned at home ultrasounds because they didn't want women to do an ultrasound at home, see they were having a girl, and then abort it. This is a really sad, dark one, but so was the story. So if you did a historical analysis and then you found an example, the one China policy is a really obvious one. But there are other examples, like in Puerto Rico, they were sterilizing women. And now I was saving this one for our critical race, but you can add this or feminist. Okay, so this is America. This article is from the New York Times. Let me find it here. And it came out in 2022. And it's about the American government's history of forced, coerced, and secret sterilization. So, if we were doing this historical analysis, we can say our thesis would be something along the lines of while readers may see, readers find Vonnegut's dystopian population control measures to be heartless and inhumane. However, governments have been utilizing, we can say, various forms of sterilization policies on the masses for centuries. And then that would be a historical literary analysis. You could use an example of, and you could either do the China one or you could do China and America, or you could just focus specifically on comparing China's policy and some of the similarities. And then you would use some examples from the text, which would obviously be like your literary element. So comparable to the one China policy is the, I guess, volunteer suicide program in Kurt Vonnegut's dystopian story, and then you can make comparisons. And they don't have to be exact, as long as you're making an explanation as to why you interpret. So if it's not the perfect parallel, don't worry.